My name is Avery Collins, and I'm about to tell you how a single Excel spreadsheet brought down an entire VP's career. At 35, I'd spent the last 7 years as a senior financial analyst at Valoran Consulting Group, a mid-tier consulting firm nestled in the suburbs of Boston that was growing faster than anyone expected. I was the kind of employee who preferred numbers to office politics, formulas to water cooler gossip, and the clean logic of spreadsheets to the messy dynamics of corporate life. I should have seen it coming the moment they called me into HR on that gray October morning. The email was brief, clinical. Please report to conference room B at 10 a.m. Bring your laptop and access cards. No context, no warning. Just the corporate equivalent of a death sentence delivered in Arial font. The conference room smelled like stale coffee and desperation. Clarissa Vaughn, our vice president of operations, sat across from me with her perfectly manicured nails drumming against the glass table. At 42, she'd mastered the art of corporate manipulation, turning every meeting into a psychological chess match where she always held the advantage. Her smile was sharp enough to cut glass, and her eyes held the cold calculation of someone who'd climbed the corporate ladder by stepping on others. "Avery," she began, her voice carrying that false warmth that made my skin crawl. "We need to discuss some concerns about your recent performance and cultural fit." Cultural fit? The corporate euphemism for "you're asking too many questions." Beside her sat Janet Morrison from HR, a woman who'd perfected the art of looking sympathetic while wielding the knife. The company's retained lawyer, a thin man whose name I'd never bothered to learn, shuffled through papers with the enthusiasm of someone preparing for a funeral. "We've decided to part ways," Clarissa continued, her smile never wavering. "Effective immediately. This is a mutual decision that benefits everyone involved." Mutual. As if I'd somehow agreed to this corporate execution, they had it all planned out with military precision. My laptop would be remotely wiped within minutes. My access cards would be deactivated before I reached the parking garage. The USB drive I'd left conspicuously on my desk would be confiscated and destroyed. They'd even prepared a story about my departure, a family emergency that required my immediate attention, followed by a decision to pursue other opportunities. But here's what they didn't know. I'd been preparing for this moment for 3 months. It started back in July, during one of those mind-numbing quarterly reviews where everyone pretends the numbers make sense. I was deep in the weeds of our Q2 performance data, cross-referencing client billings against operational costs, when I noticed something that made my forensic accountant instincts twitch. There was a line item buried in the expense reports: client entertainment and travel coordination for $85,000. The amount wasn't unusual for a consulting firm our size, but the timing was wrong. I'd been the one to originally input that data, and I remembered it clearly because I'd questioned it at the time. The expense had been legitimate then, tied to a series of client meetings in Chicago and Atlanta. But now, somehow, that same $85,000 had been reclassified and moved into the executive compensation pool. I stared at my screen for a long moment, feeling that familiar tightness in my chest that came with discovering something that didn't belong. Our net revenue had increased by only 3.2% over the previous quarter. Hardly spectacular growth, but the VP bonus pool had swelled by nearly 40%. The math didn't add up. And in my world, when math didn't add up, someone was lying. I spent the next week quietly digging deeper, using my legitimate access to trace the paper trail. What I found made my blood run cold. The client entertainment expense wasn't an isolated incident. There were dozens of similar transfers, all small enough to avoid triggering automatic audit flags, all cleverly disguised as legitimate business expenses. A leadership development seminar in Cabo that looked suspiciously like a vacation. Strategic planning retreats at luxury resorts. Client relationship building expenses that coincided with Clarissa's personal travel. The pattern was clear once you knew what to look for. But it was buried so deep in the system that only someone with my level of access and attention to detail would notice. The beautiful thing about being a financial analyst is that you become invisible. People see you as a necessary evil, someone who processes numbers and generates reports, but doesn't really matter in the grand scheme of things. They forget that you have access to everything, that you can see the entire financial picture from multiple angles, that you understand the relationships between seemingly unrelated data points. Clarissa had been stealing from the company for at least 2 years, probably longer. She'd been clever about it, spreading the fraud across multiple departments and budget categories, using her position to approve expenses that should have been flagged for review. The total amount was staggering, nearly $400,000 in misappropriated funds, all of it flowing directly into the executive compensation pool. I should have gone to the CFO immediately. That would have been the proper thing to do, the ethical thing to do. But I'd been watching office politics long enough to know how these things worked. Clarissa had cultivated relationships throughout the company, had allies in HR and finance, had dirt on people who might otherwise oppose her. A direct accusation would have been deflected, explained away, and ultimately turned back on me. Instead, I decided to be strategic about it. I started attending meetings with a different perspective, watching how Clarissa operated, observing the network of enablers and silent accomplices who made her fraud possible. There was Marcus Webb, the finance director who signed off on expense reports without really reviewing them. There was Janet Morrison, who'd helped craft the policies that made the fraud possible in the first place. There was Tom Bradley, the operations manager who'd been mysteriously promoted after agreeing to certain budget adjustments. The company culture at Valorant was a perfect breeding ground for this kind of corruption. We had motivational posters about integrity and accountability plastered all over the walls. But the bathroom sinks had been broken for 3 months and nobody bothered to fix them. We had team-building exercises and corporate values workshops, but the break room was covered in passive-aggressive notes about dirty dishes and stolen lunches. People were scared of being laid off, scared of being passed over for promotions, scared of being labeled as troublemakers. So they kept their heads down and did what they were told, even when what they were told was clearly wrong. I tested the waters in early August during a routine budget review meeting. The conference room was full of the usual suspects. Clarissa at the head of the table, Marcus shuffling through papers, Janet taking notes on her tablet, and a handful of department heads who looked like they'd rather be anywhere else. I noticed some discrepancies in the client entertainment allocations, I said, keeping my voice neutral and professional. The numbers don't seem to match the original expense reports. Clarissa's smile didn't waver, but I caught the flash of something dangerous in her eyes. Good catch, Avery. Numbers can be tricky, can't they? Why don't you send me the details after the meeting, and we'll get it sorted out? But there was no follow-up. No request for details, no correction to the reports. Instead, I found myself subtly excluded from subsequent meetings. My emails were ignored or responded to with terse, dismissive replies. My access to certain financial systems was quietly restricted, ostensibly for security reasons. The message was clear: back off, or face the consequences. That's when I knew I was dealing with something much bigger than simple accounting errors. Clarissa wasn't just stealing money, she was running a sophisticated operation that required the complicity of multiple departments. And anyone who threatened that operation would be eliminated. I spent the next month walking a tightrope, maintaining my normal work routines while quietly gathering evidence. I learned to be invisible in a different way, to fade into the background while my eyes and ears collected information. I discovered that Clarissa had been manipulating expense reports for years, that the leadership retreats were actually personal vacations, that the client entertainment expenses were fabricated entirely. The most damning evidence came from email threads that I wasn't supposed to see. Thanks to a quirk in our system permissions, I had access to archived communications from the finance department. Buried in a thread about budget reconciliation, I found a message from Clarissa to Marcus that made my hands shake as I read it. Just need to massage the numbers for Q3 to smooth out the executive compensation alignment. Nothing major, just some creative reclassification. The audit team won't dig this deep, and even if they do, we can explain it as a timing issue. Creative reclassification. Corporate speak for fraud. I printed that email and several others, storing them in a folder that I kept locked in my desk. But I knew that wouldn't be enough. If Clarissa suspected I was onto her, she'd find a way to make the evidence disappear, just like she'd make me disappear. So I began planning my own disappearance. In a way, I started backing up files to an encrypted USB drive that I kept hidden in my tea cabinet at home. Not just the obvious smoking guns, but everything: budget reports, expense allocations, email threads, approval chains. I created a comprehensive paper trail that would be impossible to deny or explain away. But I also created a decoy. I left a second USB drive in my desk drawer, one that contained harmless files and obvious duplicates of information they already knew I had access to. If they searched my workspace after firing me, they'd find exactly what they expected to find. The real evidence would be safe at home, waiting for the right moment. I also began documenting everything: dates, times, conversations, policy violations. I created a detailed timeline of the fraud, complete with supporting evidence and cross-references. I researched Valoran's compliance policies and discovered that employees had the right to report suspected fraud to external auditors without fear of retaliation. In theory, anyway. By September, I could feel the walls closing in. My workload was being redistributed to other analysts. My input was no longer sought for strategic planning meetings. I was being systematically marginalized, pushed to the edges of the organization where my eventual departure would cause minimal disruption. I used that time to refine my documentation and prepare for the inevitable. I researched external auditing firms and found one with a reputation for thorough, discreet investigations: Marlowe and Finch, LLP. I prepared a comprehensive report that detailed the fraud, included supporting evidence, and provided clear recommendations for further investigation. The report was 73 pages long. It was thorough, professional, and devastating. On October 15th, they finally made their move. The meeting in Conference Room B was a masterclass in corporate theater. Clarissa played her role perfectly, expressing regret about the decision while making it clear that it was final and non-negotiable. Janet Morrison nodded sympathetically while presenting the severance package and non-disclosure agreement. The lawyer sat silently, ready to handle any legal challenges. They'd thought of everything. The kill switch on my laptop was activated before I'd even left the building. My access cards were deactivated while I was still in the parking garage. The USB drive from my desk was confiscated and would be destroyed according to company policy. But they'd missed one crucial detail. The USB drive they found wasn't the one that mattered. I drove home in a strange state of calm, almost euphoric. After months of tension and careful planning, the first phase was complete. They'd played their hand exactly as I'd predicted, and in doing so, they'd given me everything I needed to destroy them. That evening, I sat in my apartment with my personal laptop and the real USB drive, feeling like a conductor preparing for a symphony. I opened the encrypted files and began assembling the final version of my report. Every document was carefully organized, every accusation supported by multiple sources, every conclusion backed by irrefutable evidence. I spent 3 days crafting the perfect submission to Marlowe and Finch. The report was comprehensive but readable, detailed but not overwhelming, professional but impossible to ignore. I included copies of emails, expense reports, approval chains, and budget reconciliations. I provided a clear timeline of events and a detailed analysis of the financial impact. But most importantly, I included a section on Valoran's own compliance policies, specifically the provisions that protected whistleblowers from retaliation and guaranteed their right to report suspected fraud to external authorities. On October 20th, I submitted my report to Marlowe and Finch via encrypted email. The subject line was simple: Suspected financial fraud at Valoran Consulting Group. Confidential investigation request? Then I waited. The beautiful thing about being a ghost is that you can observe without being observed. I maintained my network of contacts within the company, people who had no idea about my role in what was about to unfold. I heard through the grapevine that Clarissa had seemed unusually stressed lately, that she'd been having closed-door meetings with the CFO, that several high-level executives had mysteriously canceled their upcoming travel plans. The first public sign that something was wrong came 3 weeks later. Valoran announced that their quarterly earnings call would be postponed. to allow for additional financial review procedures. The stock price dropped 8% in after-hours trading. Industry blogs began speculating about the delay. Financial analysts questioned whether the company was experiencing operational difficulties or accounting irregularities. The business press started paying attention to a consulting firm that had previously flown under the radar. Inside the company, according to my sources, panic was setting in. The upcoming leadership retreat in Mexico was quietly canceled. Several senior executives hired personal attorneys. The CFO began conducting unusual meetings with the board of directors. Clarissa's behavior became increasingly erratic. She missed important client meetings, snapped at subordinates, and seemed to be constantly on her phone with lawyers and advisors. The woman who had once controlled every aspect of the company's operations was losing her grip on the narrative. In December, the dam finally broke. Marlowe and Finch's investigation had been thorough and discreet, but the evidence was overwhelming. They'd not only confirmed my allegations, but had uncovered additional instances of fraud that I'd missed. The total amount of misappropriated funds was actually closer to $600,000, spread across multiple budget categories and involving several accomplices. The auditing firm presented their findings to Valorant's board of directors on December 18th. By December 20th, Clarissa Vaughn had resigned for personal health reasons. Marcus Webb was placed on administrative leave pending further investigation. Janet Morrison was reassigned to a different department with significantly reduced responsibilities. The official announcement was carefully worded to avoid admitting wrongdoing while making it clear that significant changes were being implemented. The company hired a new compliance officer, restructured the finance department, and implemented new oversight procedures for expense reporting. But the damage was done. Industry publications picked up the story, describing it as a massive internal controls breach and questioning the company's ability to manage client funds responsibly. Several major clients began reviewing their contracts with Valorant. The stock price continued to decline. I watched it all unfold from my apartment, feeling a strange mixture of satisfaction and sadness. I'd achieved what I'd set out to do, but the victory felt hollow. Good people had lost their jobs along with the bad ones. The company I'd worked for 7 years was struggling to survive. Lives had been disrupted, careers had been destroyed, and trust had been shattered. But justice had been served, in its own way. The most surreal moment came in January, when I received an anonymous text message. "You did what nobody else had the courage to do. Thank you." I never found out who sent it, but I suspected it was someone from the finance department who'd been forced to participate in the fraud against their better judgment. Someone who'd been looking for a way out but hadn't known how to find it. I kept the message saved on my phone, along with all the other evidence I'd collected. Not because I planned to use it again, but because I wanted to remember that sometimes the right thing to do is also the hardest thing to do. The media attention eventually died down, as it always does. Valorant survived the scandal, though it took years to rebuild their reputation. Some of the people involved were prosecuted, others simply disappeared from the industry. The company implemented new policies and procedures, hired new leadership, and tried to move forward. As for me, I found a new job at a smaller firm where my skills were appreciated and my questions were welcomed rather than feared. I never spoke publicly about what had happened at Valorant, never gave interviews, or wrote tell-all articles. The satisfaction of seeing justice done was enough. But I kept all the files, stored safely in an encrypted folder on my personal computer. Not as leverage or insurance, but as a reminder that sometimes one person with the right information and the courage to act can make a difference. They thought they could silence me by destroying my corporate identity, by erasing my digital footprint, by pretending I'd never existed. They forgot that I wasn't just an employee, I was an accountant, a forensic analyst, a keeper of records, and guardian of truth. They thought they could hide their crimes in the complexity of corporate finance, bury their fraud in the labyrinth of budget allocations and expense reports. They forgot that I'd built that labyrinth, that I knew every pathway and hidden corridor, that I could navigate it blindfolded. Most of all, they thought they could intimidate me into silence by threatening my career, my reputation, my livelihood. They forgot that sometimes the most dangerous person in any organization is the one who has nothing left to lose. I sit here now, 2 years later, in a different apartment in a different city, working for a different company. The files are still there, still encrypted, still safe. I open them sometimes, not out of nostalgia or regret, but out of professional curiosity. I study the patterns, the methodologies, the ways that smart people convince themselves that wrong is right. Because fraud is never just about money. It's about power, about control, about the belief that rules apply to other people, but not to you. It's about the gradual erosion of ethics, the slow slide from bending rules to breaking them, from creative interpretation to outright deception. And it's about the culture that enables it, the environment where people are rewarded for not asking questions, for not looking too closely, for not making waves, where loyalty is more valued than honesty, where conformity is more important than integrity. I learned something important during those months of investigation and preparation. The most effective form of resistance isn't dramatic confrontation or public revelation. It's careful documentation, methodical preparation, and the patience to wait for the right moment to act. They called me a troublemaker, a poor cultural fit, someone who couldn't adapt to the demands of corporate life. They were right, in a way. I was never very good at pretending that wrong was right, at staying silent when I should have spoken up, at looking the other way when I should have been paying attention. But I was very good at my job. I was very good at following the numbers, at understanding the relationships between data points, at seeing patterns that others missed. And in the end, that's what brought them down. Not righteous anger or moral outrage, but simple mathematics. The numbers didn't lie, even when the people reporting them did. I think about that sometimes. When I'm working on a particularly complex analysis or reviewing a client's financial statements, I think about the power that comes with understanding how money moves through an organization, how decisions are made and recorded, how truth can be hidden but never truly destroyed. And I think about the responsibility that comes with that power, the obligation to speak up when something is wrong, to ask questions when the answers don't make sense, to be the person who refuses to look the other way. It's not always easy. It's not always popular, it's not always safe, but it's always necessary, because in the end, numbers don't lie. People do, and someone has to be keeping track of the difference. I close the laptop and look out the window at the city lights. Tomorrow there will be new reports to analyze, new patterns to identify, new questions to ask. The work continues, as it always has, as it always will. But tonight, I allow myself a moment of satisfaction. A moment to remember that sometimes, just sometimes, the good guys win, even if nobody knows we were fighting. The phone buzzes with a text from my current supervisor. Great work on the Morrison account analysis. Your attention to detail is exactly what we need around here. I smile and put the phone away. Different company, different people, different challenges, but the same principles apply. Follow the money. Ask the hard questions. And never assume that the official story is the whole story. Because somewhere out there, in offices and conference rooms and corporate headquarters around the world, there are people who think they can get away with anything. People who believe that complexity is the same as invisibility, that authority is the same as immunity, that power is the same as permission. And somewhere out there, in cubicles and offices and quiet corners, there are people like me. People who understand that every transaction leaves a trace, that every decision creates a record, that every lie eventually contradicts itself. We're the ones who notice when the numbers don't add up. We're the ones who ask inconvenient questions. We're the ones who remember that accountability isn't just a corporate buzzword, it's a fundamental principle of civilized society. They can fire us, marginalize us, try to discredit us, but they can't change the numbers. They can't alter the facts. They can't rewrite the truth. And as long as people like me exist, as long as there are individuals who believe that right is right and wrong is wrong, regardless of who's doing the judging, they'll never be completely safe. That's the real lesson of my story. Not that revenge is sweet or that justice always prevails, but that truth has a way of surfacing, even when it's been buried deep. The numbers don't lie, even when everything else does. And sometimes, that's enough. The folder on my computer is labeled Receipts. It contains everything: the original fraud, the cover-up, the investigation, the aftermath. 73 pages of documentation that brought down a VP and changed the course of an entire company. I don't open it very often anymore, but it's there, waiting. A reminder that one person with the right information and the courage to act can make a difference, even if that person is just a senior financial analyst who happened to notice that the numbers didn't add up. Even if that person is invisible, forgettable, easily replaced. Even if that person is me. Because in the end, we're all just people doing jobs, making choices, deciding every day whether to speak up or stay silent, whether to act or look away, whether to be part of the problem or part of the solution. And sometimes, if we're very lucky and very careful and very brave, we get the chance to make a choice that matters. I made mine, and I'd make it again. The numbers don't lie. People do. And someone has to be keeping track of the difference. That someone might as well be me.